Looking now at the aerobic system and the respiratory system, with training, there would firstly be an increase in VO2 max. Now, your VO2 max is a measure of aerobic capacity, and an increase in this aerobic capacity means that the performer's maximum level is now higher than before, and that means that it therefore improves performance. It also means that as their level is higher, they can work aerobically at a higher rate, meaning that that a triathlon athlete, for example, can work at a higher rate without having to go into their anaerobic system. I mean that they can then perform better and maintain that throughout the triathlon. Secondly, you have the hypertrophy of respiratory muscles. So as respiratory muscles get stronger, they use less oxygen to contract to produce that same contractile force. I mean, the more oxygen is then used at the skeletal muscles, and then therefore overall becomes more economical when performing. This means, linking to a triathlon athlete, that as they're using less oxygen to respire, more oxygen is then transported to the skeletal muscles, meaning that they can work more efficiently for longer. As a greater volume of oxygen, they can now work with a greater volume of oxygen. This also means that tidal volume can increase, so the breathing rate doesn't need to be as high to maintain ventilation levels, as ventilation is calculated through the tidal volume multiplied by the breathing rate. So if tidal volume increases due to the hypertrophy of the respiratory muscles, the breathing rate can actually decrease, and the breathing rate is the one that contributes to the fatigue, as the respiratory muscles need to contract to produce the process of breathing. There's also a larger surface area of alveoli per inhalation. This means as the tidal volume is then increased, this means alveoli has more air in them, meaning that they would increase in volume during inhalation, meaning that the surface area is increased, and that means a higher rate of diffusion can occur between the alveoli and the capillaries, meaning that more oxygen can then be transported to the working muscles. Also, you have a lowered oxygen deficit, and as there's a lower oxygen deficit, as the body can then use more oxygen or gain more oxygen, this means that there's a lowered EPOC after performance, after the triathlon, so there will be a faster recovery time. This means that they wouldn't necessarily feel the effects of DOMS after in the following days, and can then train once again at efficiently the next day without feeling fatigue from the previous day as much. And this really benefits training for then to cause improvement. Meaning that once a race occurs, the triathlon athlete can then work at a much faster rate, and their overall performance is then increased. Without training, or lack of training, diseases including COPD and bronchiolitis are at a higher risk of occurring, as exercise helps clear the airways in the lungs, And if this isn't being worked during that, due to a lack of exercise, that means these diseases can occur later on, or much more likely to occur later on in life. Looking at this, figure 3, this shows the breathing rate during a steady state exercise, a 20-minute steady state exercise before and after a 8-week training plan for the triathlete. And as you can see, the blues is before the training plan, the orange is after the training plan. You can see the general trend here is that breathing rate has decreased or is lower than the breathing rate before the 8-week training plan. And this is likely to be a cause of the hypertrophy of the respiratory muscles, as they would need the same amount of ventilation, and as there's a higher tidal volume due to that hypertrophy, that means breathing rate doesn't have to be as high, so would be lower, and which shows here an increase in performance. Looking at the cardiovascular system now, and with training, there will be first a hypertrophy of myocardium, and the hypertrophy of the myocardium therefore increases the stroke volume, and so more blood is ejected from the left ventricle per beat, meaning that more oxygen in that blood can then be ejected to the working muscles. Another thing that would occur is bradycardia, and as the stroke volume is then increased due to the hypertrophy of the myocardium, that means there would be a lower resting heart rate to supply the same cardiac output. And due to a lower resting heart rate, this is known as bradycardia. And this also means that more that at maximum, that the cardiac output at max is increased as the stroke volume is increased, and the heart rate will eventually go back up to its max levels, as that hasn't changed. Also due to bradycardia, this then increases the heart rate range of the performer. So if the performer was 20, if the triathlete was 20, that means their maximum heart rate would be 200. If their resting heart rate was then, let's say, 70, that gives them a maximum heart rate range of 130. But due to bradycardia, their resting heart rate could decrease to 60, meaning that their heart rate range is then increased to 140. And this means that they can work a much larger range, so that their overall performance would then increase. Also, you have an increase in capillary density. This means that more blood can be supplied to the working muscles, as there's a higher density of capillaries at the working muscles. So that means more oxygen can be transported into the working muscles for aerobic respiration to occur, or the aerobic energy system to use. You also have an increased hematocrit levels caused by the increase in blood volume, and therefore hemoglobin count. This means that more oxygen can be transported at once to the working muscles, and similarly more carbon dioxide can be transported out of the working muscles as it's a waste product. Overall, this means that the performance of the triathlete would increase or improve, as if they can transport more oxygen from the atmosphere into their body and then into the working muscles. They can work aerobically for longer, which can be worked at a high duration, meaning that they can work more efficiently and also at a higher rate, meaning that performance would overall increase. Also, blood pressure is likely to decrease through training, particularly the systolic blood pressure, and therefore would reduce the risk of hypertension and also reduce the risk of coronary heart disease and the hardening of arteries known as atherosclerosis over time. So through training, there will be a reduced risk of these diseases later in life. Looking at figure 4 here, this shows the heart rate during a multi-stage fitness test before and after an 8-week training period for the triathlete. So you can see first at rest, with the blue being before the 8-week training plan and the orange being after the 8-week training plan. You can see at rest there's a lower heart rate due to bradycardia, but then also as the test goes on, you can see that the heart rate after the 8-week training plan is consistently lower than the one before the training plan, and also increases at a much slower rate compared to here, where there's a sharp increase here and a couple of sharp increases throughout the test. This also means that the performer would be able to work for longer, and this can be shown through a higher level achieved over time, whereas the before the 8-week training plan, the performer, for example, could reach level 8 as its maximum, but afterwards would be able to reach, for example, level 10, as it's a lower heart rate, meaning that they can work aerobically for longer before having to work anaerobically. Looking at the neuromuscular system, with training, there would then be an increase in mitochondria count and also an increase in muscular endurance. So an increase with more mitochondria, this means more ATP production through the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, as this process is located in the mitochondria. There's also an increased volume of myoglobin count, as more myoglobin means that more oxygen stored to use during aerobic respiration, so that means it's more readily available when needed, meaning that it can be used faster, so it won't have to fatigue before relying on the aerobic system. And there's a more toned and dense, slow oxidative muscle fibers, and as it's more toned and dense, this means there's more consistent muscle contractions, meaning that it will take longer for them to fatigue. And if it takes them longer to fatigue, that means the triathlete can work at a higher intensity before fatiguing, meaning that their overall time would be quicker and their overall performance would improve.